I had recently completed overseeing a major installation in Spokane and was driving east on Interstate 90 to visit an old friend, Joe Neely, who resided along Lake Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho. While I had visited the Pacific Northwest before, this was my first time in this particular part of Idaho. Joe and I had served together many years ago at Cherry Point, North Carolina. I had met his wife and their first child and had shared many dinners at their home. Despite the distance, we had promised to keep in touch and had exchanged cards and letters over the years. However, I hadn't heard from him in several months, so when I mentioned my trip to Spokane, he invited me to visit. Following his directions, I arrived at his log house situated on a wooded bluff overlooking Lake Coeur d'Alene. Joe emerged from the back of the house as I pulled up, and we greeted each other with hearty handshakes and hugs. He appeared older than I remembered, but was still as strong as ever. "How have you been, you old salt?" he asked. "Fair to middlin'," I replied. "And you?" I could complain, but it wouldn't do any damn good, he chuckled. "Come on out back, I've got elk steaks on the grill and some beer in the cooler." The aroma of barbecue and the promise of elk steaks made my mouth water. "Where's your lovely wife?" I inquired as he handed me a cold beer. "She passed away a few months ago," he said with a hint of sadness. "She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but it was too late by the time they caught it." "I'm sorry to hear that," I offered sympathetically. "Wendy was a wonderful woman." "Thank you," he replied. "She was indeed the best." "Are you seeing anyone else?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nah," he sighed. "Wendy wanted me to find someone after she was gone, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Once you've been married to the best, everything else falls short." He served the elk steaks, and we began eating. It was my first time trying elk meat, and I found it to be quite delicious. "How are you holding up?" I inquired. "I'm managing," he said. "At least I have this beautiful view to enjoy every day." He gestured towards the lake. "Wendy and I fell in love with this place when we first laid eyes on it, so I decided to stay. The kids visit a couple of times a year, and I get to spoil the grandkids." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You know, Wendy wasn't my first wife," he revealed. "No, I didn't know that," I admitted. "I never shared the story of my first wife with you, but if it weren't for her infidelity, I would never have met Wendy," Joe began. "I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I've read your stories on Literotica. Really enjoyed them." "Thanks," I replied. "It's just a hobby of mine while I'm on the road. Just for fun." "You stirred up quite a reaction with a couple of them," he said, grinning. "Forget the critics, keep on writing." "I appreciate that," I said. "Maybe you'd like to write a story about what happened with my first wife," he suggested. "I'd be interested in hearing it," I replied, taking out an audio recorder. "Do you mind if I record this? I want to make sure I capture it accurately." "Go ahead," he agreed, and I set the recorder on the table between us before he began his story. Joe's story. I enlisted in the Marine Corps right after high school in 1974. It was either that or spend my life working at my dad's hardware store. After boot camp, I was stationed at MCAS El Toro in California. That's where I met Marcy. She was a year younger than me, and we hit it off right away. We dated for several months before I proposed. She said yes, and her father, a career Marine who served 3 tours in Vietnam, gave us his blessing. We had a small church wedding and went to Vegas for our honeymoon. I thought I had everything I ever wanted. Marcy was beautiful, with long curly blonde hair and all the right curves. She was also adventurous in bed. And yes, she was quite skilled at certain activities. She was also a bit of an exhibitionist. I remember one night we were in the pool at our apartment complex in Anaheim. It was empty, so she took off her bikini and showed off for me. She even shaved herself for the occasion. I wasn't about to let that go to waste. I joined her, and we had a passionate encounter right there in the pool. Afterwards, instead of covering up, Marcy walked naked back to our second-story apartment, where anyone could have seen her. Once inside, she continued to entertain me, putting on quite a show. I won't go into too much detail, but it was a memorable night. That's how things were between us, and I felt like the luckiest man alive. About 6 months after we married, I received orders for a 1-year tour in Okinawa. It was tough, but we managed to make it work. Since Marcy was attending night classes to become a certified nurse while working, we opted to keep the apartment. I arranged for an allotment from my pay to cover the rent, leaving her with just utilities to worry about, which wasn't much of a concern. She had her own car and preferred it over driving my truck, so transportation wasn't an issue. We shared a passionate night before I departed, promising to remain faithful and correspond daily. Leaving like that was tough, but I had no other option. For the first 10 months, we exchanged hot, steamy letters. I eagerly anticipated her scented letters, getting aroused reading her desires for us. About 6 weeks before my return from Okinawa, Marcy mentioned her friend Bridget's trip to San Francisco during a break and asked if she could join. I agreed, on the condition that she kept in touch and updated me on her whereabouts. Initially, she upheld her end of the bargain, but then the letters stopped arriving. Despite my continued correspondence, I received no response. A week before my scheduled return, I called our apartment from the USO, but there was no answer. I contacted Bridget, who informed me that Marcy extended her stay to visit high school friends, whose details she didn't have. This revelation puzzled me as I wasn't aware of Marcy having friends there. My letters to her in San Francisco were returned unopened, marked address unknown. Concerned, I reached out to Marcy's parents in San Diego, who hadn't heard from her either. With no means of instant communication like we have today, I was left worried about her well-being. Marcy's parents agreed to pick me up from March Air Force Base upon my return if I hadn't heard from her. As my departure date approached, I attempted to contact home again but received no response. I informed Marcy's parents, who were displeased but agreed to fetch me and accompany me to the apartment. As promised, Marcy's parents picked me up at March Air Force Base and drove me back to the apartment. It was already dark when we arrived, and there were no lights on in the apartment windows. With her father's help, I carried my belongings upstairs to the apartment. Upon entering, I hoped to find Marcy, but instead, I was greeted by a deserted, dusty apartment. Despite Marcy's meticulous cleaning habits, everything was covered in a layer of dust, indicating it had been untouched for some time. Her father and I searched for any signs of her presence, but found none. Most of her belongings, including the majority of her clothes and jewelry, were gone. He noticed a pawn ticket on the dresser and handed it to me. I had no clue what she could have pawned, but I resolved to call the shop in the morning. "Keep me informed if you find anything," her father said before leaving. "We're here to help if you need us." I thanked him and unpacked my belongings, finding no further clues about her whereabouts. Down in the garage, I saw my truck parked where I left it. Marcy's car, usually parked in a designated spot, was also there. Frustrated and confused, I called the local police to report her missing but encountered obstacles. Frustrated, I decided to call it a night and went to bed. The following day, I received my first lead. I called the pawn shop listed on the ticket and discovered that Marcy had sold her wedding and engagement rings for $100. I was livid. I had saved up for those rings and paid a hefty price for them. Despite the shop's offer to repurchase them, I declined. In anger, I removed my own ring and smashed it with a hammer. While cleaning and packing, I stumbled upon a stack of letters addressed to Marcy from someone named John in San Francisco. The letters dated back 6 months before she mentioned her trip. Shocked and hurt, I began reading them. The letters were filled with explicit content, revealing that Marcy and John had been having an affair throughout our marriage, meeting before school or during my duty hours. Reading one particularly vile letter, I felt sick to my stomach. Their plan to make it appear as though she vanished became apparent as I continued reading. It dawned on me that Marcy had completed her nursing education and was likely pursuing a job in San Francisco. She deliberately withheld this information from me as part of their scheme. I was beyond furious. How could she betray our marriage like this? I had ample opportunities to be unfaithful, but I remained loyal. I called Marcy's parents and spoke to her mother, Jenny. "Hello, Joe," she greeted me. "Have you found out anything about Marcy?" "Yeah," I responded bitterly. Turns out she's living with some guy named John in San Francisco. John? Ginny inquired. John Calloway? That's the one, I confirmed. Did you know about this? No, Joe, I had no idea, she confessed. Marcy and John dated in high school, but I thought it ended when you two got together. Apparently not, I replied, seething. They've been deceiving me throughout our entire marriage, plotting this all along. Oh, Joe, I'm so sorry, Ginny sympathized. What are your plans? I'm filing for divorce, I declared firmly. I understand, she said, her voice filled with regret. Is there anything we can do to help? Yeah, I said. You can come and collect her belongings. I don't want any of it. I just want my essentials, clothes, TV, tools, and stereo. Her car is still here, too. All right, Joe. I'll speak to her brothers, and we'll come over to gather her things this weekend, Ginny assured me. After ending the call, I flipped through the phone book to find a lawyer. With countless options, I eventually secured an appointment for Friday, which was 3 days away. Although not how I intended to spend my leave, I had no alternative. Realizing I needed to confirm Marcy's whereabouts, I located John's address from the letters. Determined, I prepared for a road trip. I closed our bank accounts, withdrawing over $3,500 in cash. Despite Marcy taking her share, I had some savings from my time in Okinawa. The journey took a grueling 8 hours, navigating through LA and Orange counties. Upon arrival, I checked into a motel and purchased a camera and detailed city map. After a meal and some rest, I studied the map, pinpointing John's address. I planned to conduct surveillance discreetly, aiming to capture photos of them together to present to her parents and the lawyer. The following morning, I drove to John's neighborhood and located the apartment complex where he and Marcy resided. Parking about 100 feet away from the main gate, I observed discreetly. I wore a worn baseball cap and sunglasses, hoping to blend in. It didn't take long to spot them. John and Marcy emerged from the gate, heading to a red Mustang convertible. John wore cutoffs and a t-shirt, while Marcy donned a sundress. I discreetly snapped a couple of photos with my camera. Anticipating a brief absence, I waited patiently. Upon their return in the afternoon, I noted John's license plate, Johnmark. As they engaged in intimate moments by the car, I documented everything, knowing it would serve as evidence for my divorce. Despite the urge to confront them, I maintained my composure. Marcy's explicit actions stirred anger within me, but I focused on gathering evidence. Eventually, they retreated to John's apartment, Marcy remaining unclothed. Observing their movements, I ensured they couldn't see John's car from their apartment. Feeling a pressing need to relieve myself, I executed a drastic but symbolic act. Ensuring no one witnessed me, I defiled Marcy's discarded dress and John's car. Though reluctant to vandalize his vehicle, I justified it as a response to their betrayal. Despite the risk of being caught, my anger overshadowed any concern. After hastily cleaning up, I departed, content with the evidence I acquired. Upon returning to Orange County, I had the film developed at a photo lab. Within hours, I held the incriminating photos and negatives, ready to proceed with my divorce case. I managed to grab a few hours of sleep before my appointment with the attorney, then showered and shaved. Gathering the incriminating evidence, the photos, pawn ticket, and John's letters, I hit the road again. Upon meeting the attorney, I discovered California's no-fault divorce policy, meaning the circumstances of Marcy's actions wouldn't affect the division of assets. Despite her misconduct, everything would be split equally. I disclosed our financial situation and Marcy's higher income, emphasizing her nursing certification and part-time employment. The lawyer cautioned against concealing information, assuring me of legal provisions for my absence during proceedings. Providing Marcy's address, I arranged for her to be served with the divorce papers. With everything in motion, the lawyer estimated a 6-month time frame for the divorce process. After returning home, I informed the apartment management of my imminent departure and arranged for utilities to be shut off. Marcy's family arrived the following Saturday to clear out her belongings and retrieve her car. When her father inquired about the situation, I showed him the evidence. Shocked, he expressed regret for Marcy's actions and inquired if I retaliated. I assured him I refrained from physical harm but confessed to altering John's car and Marcy's dress. Despite his initial surprise, he understood my frustration and offered his support. As he departed, he extended an invitation to stay in touch and visit their home. Grateful, I thanked him for his understanding and support. After a long day, I treated myself to a beer and burger before returning to my now empty apartment. With nothing left but the bare floor, I settled in for the night. The following day, I completed the cleaning and loaded my truck with the few belongings I had left: clothes, TV, stereo from Okinawa, and tools. Securing everything, I covered the truck bed and spent one final night on the floor before departing the next day, retrieving my security and cleaning deposit. With some time before settling into Cherry Point, North Carolina, I stopped to visit my folks in Texas. Arriving at Cherry Point with over $2,500 in cash and the apartment refund check, I opened a new account at the credit union and moved into the barracks. A couple of months later, I received news from the attorney that the divorce was finalized. Marcy didn't contest anything and didn't seek support. To celebrate, I went to a local bar where I met Wendy. We hit it off, both cautious after recent disappointments. Over months of dating, our connection deepened, culminating in a revealing moment during a dance. "Do you like to eat pussy?" Wendy whispered in my ear, catching me off guard. "As a matter of fact, I do," I replied. "Then take me home and show me," she challenged, slipping her panties into my hand. Without hesitation, I escorted her to my truck. By the time we arrived home, she had undressed, teasing me with her aroused state. We spent hours in passionate lovemaking, and afterward, as we lay together, she looked into my eyes with a sense of understanding and connection. "You know, I'm strictly committed to one person," she expressed. "Cheating is a deal-breaker for me." "I've always been loyal to one woman," I reassured her. "And I've just ended a marriage because of infidelity." Her response was a warm embrace and a deep kiss, sealing our connection. That night, I proposed, and she accepted. A few months later, we exchanged vows at the base chapel, and the rest, as they say, is history. "So, Joe," I inquired, "did you ever cross paths with your ex-wife after that?" He took a sip of his beer before responding. "As a matter of fact, I did," he began. "About 10 years later, her father, who retired from the Corps, was opening a gun shop. He invited Wendy and me to join the celebration with his family, so we went. Since I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, it wasn't too far for us to drive over. We brought along our 3 kids in the SUV. He paused to take another sip. She was there alone. Apparently, she caught John cheating on her with someone else, he revealed. She looked quite different. I'd say she gained about 100 pounds since I last saw her. When she saw us together, she was visibly shaken. I introduced her to Wendy and the kids, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Then, I leaned in and asked, "Did John ever clean out his car after all that mess?" A smirk crossed his face as he reminisced, taking another sip. "She nearly lost it," he chuckled. "Was it you who did that?" she demanded. I simply replied, "I'm not saying anything," and walked away. "Did she ever offer an apology or explanation for her actions?" I inquired. He shook his head. "No, she never apologized, and honestly, I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. What's done is done, and her words wouldn't change a thing," he stated firmly. He handed me a photo of him, Wendy, and their children. "However, something positive did come out of it," he continued. "What's that?" I asked. "If Marcy hadn't betrayed me, I wouldn't have met Wendy, and we wouldn't have our 3 wonderful children," he reflected. "That sounds like 4 blessings to me," I remarked. He paused, a smile forming on his lips as he clinked his beer bottle against mine. "Indeed, 4 blessings, and let's not overlook our 6 beautiful grandchildren. And counting. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos.